Hi, I'm Cyndi Lauper. My scalp was covered with psoriasis, which could lead to psoriatic arthritis. But Cosentyx treats both.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis 300 milligram dose and adults with active psoriatic arthritis 150 milligram dose. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at Cosentyx.com or 1-844-COSENTYX.
Cosentyx works for me.
Ask your doctor about Cosentyx.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
I am very, very pleased to be joined by Diane Sare. She's an independent candidate for New York State, for U.S. Senate in New York State. But she has a lot of interests and a lot of opinions about issues affecting the entire country and, quite frankly, the entire world. You know, it's funny. I thought for sure when I had Diane on the radio 2 years ago that a lot of the audience was going to give me a hard time for having someone on that didn't have a chance of winning or having someone on that was part of the LaRouche movement. Do you know, and you could go back and look at the criticism in the Facebook group if you want. Do you know what the biggest criticism I got 2 years ago when I had Diane Sare on the radio was? That the interview was too short. Not joking, that was the criticism. So it took me 2 years, but she is back. Diane Sare, thanks so much for getting up early with us. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Really glad to be here with you again.
Diane, I know you're running as an independent candidate. I know a lot of folks that have actually voted for you, very politically astute folks as well. You're part of the LaRouche movement, which maybe we could talk about in a second. Why did you make the decision to run as an independent candidate rather than as a Democrat when most of Lyndon LaRouche's runs for president, for instance, were as a Democrat? Why go third party?
Well, it's very interesting. You know, on his 90th birthday, he declared, I think that was 2012, he said the two-party system is dead. It's done. It's over. And he always had sort of a brawl with the Democratic Party up to that point. He wrote a platform for conservative Democrats. He particularly had battles with people like Lieberman and others, Hillary Clinton. We called for the impeachment of Barack Obama. So, you know, it's right now, the two parties, and we see it, they get so much money from these billionaires that you don't have any freedom as a party candidate. You're told what to say, and frankly, the deck is stacked. And we saw that with Robert Kennedy Jr., where he was literally told it doesn't matter if you win the primary, the delegates are going to go to Joe Biden.
Right. Right. Well, that's fair. You know, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I'm sure it's a question you've gotten pretty frequently, and I'd rather talk about issues that affect the public. But you are part of the LaRouche movement. The name of your party is, has LaRouche in the title. The LaRouche movement has been described by some as a fringe political group or even a cult, and a lot of its views are viewed as controversial. What would you say to voters concerned about the movement's reputation? What differentiates the LaRouche platform from other political ideologies?
Well, I think the thing about LaRouche was that he was a true American patriot and part of the American, what you could call the American intellectual tradition. I don't know of anyone that I ever met that understood the Constitution better than he did, particularly the work of Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, John Quincy Adams, others. And I think that they use these slanders, frankly, to keep Americans away from heavy ideas. We're supposed to be shallow, treat the elections like a horse race or gambling event or something,
Right.
And not take up these profound questions. So by putting labels on it, you can, like an invisible electric fence, don't go there.
Well, I like having discussions about the big issues, which is one of the reasons that I invited you on. And this is the last question I'm going to ask about this. What about those cult accusations? By the way, at 30 minutes after the hour, this is The Other Side of Midnight. My guest is Diane Sare. She's running for U.S. Senate. There's a perception that the LaRouche movement operates with cult-like secrecy and authoritarianism. How would you respond to those accusations? And can you explain what role transparency plays within your campaign and within the LaRouche movement itself?
Transparency? Well, I'm very transparent. Many people working with me say that I seem to be incapable of hiding what is on my mind, which is why I'm not a good poker player. These things come from groups. One, the Anti-Defamation League ran a huge smear campaign of LaRouche back in the 70s when he was trying to advocate for a two-state peace plan based on economic development, greening the desert, and Henry Kissinger personally intervened to sabotage it. And they called LaRouche anti-Semitic. He was working with the peace faction in Israel and certain Arab leaders at the time, and really rubbed people the wrong way, and also disrupted an attempt to pit black parents against Jewish teachers in New York City, which was a design. And I think, they create these lies to stop people from working together. And they've, unfortunately, today largely succeeded. We are terribly polarized, and people are unbelievably emotional about whether someone might be supporting Trump or Kamala Harris. Now, I do think if Kamala Harris wins, we might not be alive, but I don't think that's a reason for me to be completely hysterical with people who perhaps may not know what I know, so they're supporting her. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I think I've complained about the same thing, that kind of polarization. Needless to say, it doesn't sound like you're a fan of Kamala Harris, but because of the polarized nature of the electorate these days, a lot of folks do make judgments about who they're going to support for other offices based on who that person is supporting for president. Are you supporting Donald Trump for president?
I am not endorsing a candidate. I think the number one issue is avoiding thermonuclear war. And I can say, at least from the Trump side, there was one very important op-ed written by Donald Trump Jr. and Robert Kennedy Jr. about the danger of continuing to escalate with Ukraine versus Russia. The danger of giving Ukraine permission to use long-range missiles to strike deep into Russia, that this does pose a real threat. I have seen no such recognition from the Democratic side. So, that's what I can say about it. But I cannot. There are so many things that I am not happy about with Trump. I would not endorse, even if I plan to vote that way. I will only tell people what I just said, which is that the Kamala Harris option means absolutely there is not a chance of survival in any recognizable form.
Diane, for people that are curious about your background, what kind of work do you do? What do you do for a living?
I've been a political organizer for 36 years. I met my husband, who was working on LaRouche's presidential campaign in 1988. This was when the witch hunt against LaRouche was just getting started, and he ended up in prison. By the way, the person who first indicted LaRouche was Robert Mueller in Boston, and that case, by the way, fell apart, and they made up a new one and tried it in Virginia. I was trained to be a classical musician. I was a student at New England Conservatory, where I had transferred to after 1 year at Hamilton College, which which I really loved, by the way. A shout out to Hamilton. That was a great place.
If people are just tuning in, this is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. My guest is Diane Sare. She is running for U.S. Senate. If you're interested in learning more about her, you could absolutely check out her website and see what she's all about. That's sareforsenate.com, SAREFOR, Senate.com. All right, Diane, let's talk policy. You've indicated that you would like a new investigation into what happened on September 11th. I'm wondering if you could clarify your views when it comes to this subject. Do you think that 9/11 may have been an inside job? If so, what evidence leads you to possibly think that?
Well, the evidence that leads me to think that is how dramatically our policies changed in the aftermath of it. One, the surveillance, the lack of trust, the idea that we always had to live in fear and therefore it was okay for the government to spy on every aspect of your life. The plunge into war with Iraq, which had nothing to do with it whatsoever. But we tortured some poor guy into saying that they had weapons of mass destruction, which they didn't. There was no Al Qaeda there. So we had a dramatic change in policy. LaRouche actually had made a forecast. He warned on January 3rd of 2001. You remember that was the first time we had an election where the result wasn't known for quite a long time. And he said, look, Bush is coming in without a clear mandate. And when Bush was talking about bringing in John Ashcroft as Attorney General, LaRouche said, watch out for a Reichstag fire event, that referring to when Hitler had one of his own friends set the German parliament building on fire and then came out screaming, the communists have attacked us and we have to go to war. LaRouche said, watch out for a Reichstag fire event that would be used by a weak president to rule by decree, to rule by crisis management and through fear because he has no clear mandate. So that was January of 2001. Then later in August of 2001, LaRouche was warning of a terror attack on Washington. In fact, the morning of 9/11, I lived in D.C. at the time. We were handing out a broadsheet warning of a terror attack on the nation. And the next thing we know, people are saying, have you heard what's happened in New York? And then the Pentagon was hit, which was, my husband was only a mile from there when that happened. What a day. I will never forget that. And I was at a campus speaking to some students a few weeks ago, and I realized every single one of them had been born after 9/11 and had never known the kind of childhood that I knew, or perhaps you knew, where you don't have a cell phone, you're gone for the day, no one worries about it, no one thinks any harm is going to come to you, and sure enough, you come back home.
Choosing a bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drink that's all flavor and just 100 calories? Easy. Choosing between creamy vanilla, double chocolate, and sea salt caramel flavors? A little harder. Try the delicious new Starbucks Frappuccino light drinks. Look for them wherever you buy groceries. Start with Starbucks coffee.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I do think, though, when you make a very compelling case about the ramifications of what happened on September 11th, whenever that issue of 9/11 potentially being an inside job comes up, though, there's always a backlash from some survivors, from families who find that kind of perspective offensive. How do you respond to those folks that may like what you say about foreign policy, about domestic policy, about all sorts of things, but they find that sort of a third rail, 9/11 trutherism, and they find that maybe too offensive to vote for you?
Well, I think you have to consider the Kennedy assassination, the fact that we never got to the bottom of that, but the Warren Commission was obviously a fraud. And you have to think of who would want to change it. In other words, it's not the whole government. It's not your Congress. Although I will say there were some very peculiar deals between the Saudi government and Margaret Thatcher, and a petroleum for weapons deal between British Aerospace and the Saudis. And by the way, I also do have to say, in this context, British Aerospace sending all these weapons to the Saudis. Remember how many Saudis were hijackers on the airplanes and why they never were brought up. And I worked closely with members of the 9/11 families to get the ability to go after Saudi Arabia for this. Kirsten Gillibrand's father-in-law was a major executive of British Aerospace. And after 9/11, the records on the deal between British Aerospace and the Saudis somehow all got removed. So you can't find out what they entailed. My understanding is that it was a tanker of petroleum a day in exchange for unlimited weapons. And that also explains a lot of the fighting in the Middle East when you consider that people on the ground in small terrorist groups would not have the capability to make their weapons themselves. Where are they going to produce them? But if you can get a bunch of stuff coming in there from British Aerospace, that's great. And remember the British policy, divide and rule, which unfortunately they haven't given up on to this day.
Let's talk about some of the conflicts that the United States is currently engaged in. You mentioned Ukraine. You've publicly opposed U.S. aid, continued and U.S. aid to Ukraine amidst their conflict with Russia. I think you've been opposed to what Israel's doing in Gaza and the United States' role in supporting Israel, right?
Yes.
Why do you believe that America should take a non-interventionist stance in those two conflicts? And what would you say to critics who argue that failing to support those countries, Ukraine and Israel specifically, could lead to broader instability that might affect our country?
Well, we, first of all, largely helped to create these conflicts. The Ukraine situation under the Obama presidency, Victoria Nuland, who was, I think, deputy political.
Yeah, she's the woman that's in charge of Ukraine in every administration except Donald Trump. Doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican. They all managed to hand the keys to Ukraine over to Victoria Nuland.
Right, and now she's joining Hillary Clinton at Columbia University.
Of course she is.
So, yeah, we overthrew their government in a violent coup, which people here claimed was a great peaceful, the Maidan in 2014, and brought in a regime that was riddled with neo-Nazi elements. And in fact, in 2018, 40 members of Congress wrote a letter saying we should not arm the Azov battalion because they are Nazis.
Right,
That's
which seems pretty
record.
reasonable, yes.
I would say so, but instead we ended up arming them, and what was not covered in the press was that 14,000 people in the Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, were killed from 2014 to 2022, while we were claiming to be negotiating for them to secure special status and get a ceasefire. And then it didn't help matters when Angela Merkel and I think it was Francois Hollande of France at the time, both said, oh, no, we never meant to negotiate. We were just trying to build up time for the Ukrainian army to get trained so they could fight Russia. So if Putin's not being paranoid, and you can't, the Soviet Union lost 27 million people to the Nazis in World War II. They repelled Napoleon. They repelled Hitler after enormous losses. 1 out of 6 people in Russia lost a family member in that war. And Putin was very clear the day he began the special military operation. He said, we will not, this is not going to happen a third time. We're not having this. And The beginning of it, remember, was very small. It was like 30 or 40,000 troops. It wasn't a force to invade and take over Ukraine. It was a force to stop that.
Diane, let me ask you to
bloodshed.
pause because
Okay.
I followed everything that you just said, and I agree with much of it. The word you just used, special military operation, that's the word Putin used to describe what's clearly a war. Why do you use that word? I mean, it is a war, right? Shouldn't we just say it's a war?
Now it is. But when he began, it really was very limited. And you may remember that just 1 month after it began, Ukraine came to the negotiating table. And they were willing to allow Crimea finally to be recognized as part of Russia, which had a referendum. The military base in Sevastopol has been Russian since Catherine the Great. And so they were willing to cede that, to agree to be neutral, to not get nuclear weapons. Both sides had all of the bloodshed that we have seen in the last 2 years would have been over. And Boris Johnson jumped on a plane and blew the thing apart and told Zelensky, you can't sue for peace. You can't get peace. You have to keep fighting. And Victoria Nuland recently revealed, not surprisingly, that she also played a role in that. And then you have idiots like Lindsey Graham saying, oh, this is so great for American jobs. Yeah, at the expense of hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians.
It's, I've yet to see a conflict that Lindsey Graham is not enthusiastically for. It doesn't matter where, but not only does he want it to happen, he wants the United States to participate. But withholding aid from allies, whether we're talking Ukraine, whether we're talking Israel, it is a significant stance. And the uniparty.
But Ukraine is not an ally.
Right. Well, they're not in NATO, but I mean, they certainly seem ally-ish based on the Republican and Democratic policymakers that run Washington. How would you address concerns that a policy of withholding aid from countries like Israel or Ukraine could weaken America's influence globally, particularly in regions where we face strategic threats?
Well, I would say that we have destroyed our influence globally, particularly by supporting Israel right now and you notice we take Zelensky, who's a complete lunatic, or Bibi Netanyahu, who is a total fascist war criminal, and we say, do whatever you want. We don't want any accountability. Just spend the money, do whatever you want. In the case of what Israel is now doing in Gaza, and the truth is coming out. I just met with a delegation of medical doctors who were in Gaza and reported and have photographs of children who have been hit squarely in the skull with snipers killing children under the age of 12. And then the blockade of the medical supplies and the food and the malnutrition. They say 100% of injuries and wounds are infection. There's not even soap. There's not even antibiotics. We are paying for this. And it is absolutely gut-wrenching. And if you don't like genocide, it does not mean you support Hamas or you support what happened October 7th, which obviously was an atrocity. But this is against international law. And the United States is looked on by the rest of the world as, frankly, a rogue nation. People take pity on us. They say, we feel really sorry for you. You have a government that, a president who's senile. You can't seem to get your government to listen to you. They know that most American people don't want to be embroiled in war and kill children all over the place. But your government isn't listening to you. People are looking at us as in Kazan, there are now 22 nations working with the BRICS. It's 57% of the world's population. Mm. And they're not against us. They just said, look, we had to get out of your system because we're not suicidal. People put money in the New York Federal Reserve, and then we seize their assets because we say we're putting sanctions, that we don't like what you did, so we're going to steal your money. Well, if I heard that my money was going to be stolen if I put it in a particular bank, I wouldn't bank there either.
That's fair. That's fair. Many would say, though, that part of America's role on the world stage is to stand against aggression for humanitarian reasons. Where do you draw the line between humanitarian intervention and your stance on non-interventionism?
We mean like the humanitarian bombs we dropped on Libya, which had such a fantastic effect, what Hillary Clinton did to that country. I mean, it's not humanitarian. Look, I think George Washington and John Quincy Adams were both very clear. In fact, I just was rereading George Washington's farewell address, and unfortunately don't have it in front of me because he said it more eloquently than I'm going to. But he said, an habitual hatred or fondness for any nation will ultimately warp the foreign policy of the United States. He said we should strive to have friendly relations with all, but not obsessively one-sided relations. And I think you really see that now. And John Quincy Adams, as you know, said, do not seek abroad for monsters to destroy. Well,
I love that quote, too. But something like the Holocaust, for instance. The Nazis are carrying out the Holocaust in the midst of what was going on in the 30s and 40s. Let's say Germany had not declared war on the United States and they were not interested in a military armed conflict with the United States. Would you have intervened to stop something like the Holocaust if you knew it was going on?
You know, yes, and because it also was a war, they were waging a war of aggression and launching all these other wars. But it's very tricky because remember who funded Hitler, right? Montague Norman and Prescott Bush, Brown Brothers Harriman. Our bankers were directly involved in creating that atrocity. And so then we ultimately had to get involved to prevent it. I mean, if you're going to take that analogy, then we should be entering the war today on the side of the Palestinian people.
All right.
You know, so, and I don't think we have to stop war. And if we're economically strong, if we can offer economic development, you have a means of giving people a reason to stop fighting because they can have a future that is calm and prosperous and stable, but we're not promoting that.
Diane, before we run out of time, given that the perception that the LaRouche movement appeals to a very specific audience, how do you plan to broaden your appeal to mainstream voters? Obviously, I think coming on shows like this one is a great place to start, but what common ground can you find with those outside the traditional base of the LaRouche movement?
Well, if you ever went to a LaRouche conference, you would see it was the most diverse group of people you ever imagined you could meet. But I would say the unifying factor and what really is the cause of the conflict is the collapse of the economy, this transatlantic bubble, the bailouts, the hyperinflation. And that is what fundamentally has to be addressed. We have to return to what was known as the American system of political economy, which emphatically is not British liberal free trade. And it means investing in things which improve the productivity of our workforce, like modern high-speed rail, nuclear power, water management. What happened in North Carolina and other parts of the country when we have extreme weather is frankly an embarrassment. The Army Corps of Engineers has mapped out, they know where water is going to go when you get a flood, and we simply don't fund the infrastructure that would allow us to address this in any kind of rational way. And these things will create jobs and increase the purchasing power of the dollar. And I think almost everybody in the nation would be interested in being able to afford to have a home and put food on the table and give their children a decent standard of living.
Diane Sare, we're going to have to end it there. Best of luck to you in the election. I am sure we will talk again.
Thank you so much.
Diane Sare, if you want to comment on any portion of our discussion, feel free to do so. You can absolutely give me a call at 646-720-0635. That's 1-646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.